Hello, this is Glenda Eoyang from the Human Systems Dynamics Institute, and I want to welcome you today to Don't Just Survive, Thrive, the Power of HSD. This is the first of two webinars that we're going to give to help introduce people to the power of HSD. And for those of you who are HSD associates and colleagues and longtime friends, this is a tool to help you share the ideas with others. So as we are beginning, I'd like to share with you the fact that we're going to be doing two professional certification programs in HSD, one in London in September and October, and then one in Ottawa, Ontario in November and December. I invite you to visit our two websites and to drop a note to Julia Herzing to talk with her about what's available in those sessions. So welcome all. I'm very glad that you're here. I do want to say if you're having a challenge with technology, drop a private note to Denise Easton and she'll help resolve whatever kinds of issues are coming up. So with that, let's begin to thrive. So our plan today is to recognize that turbulent change is emergent opportunity. Very often in times of fast and turbulent change, we think that it's getting in the way of opportunity, that it's limiting our possibilities for action. But in fact, turbulent change can be an opportunity to open up lots of new possibilities if you know how to use it well. We're going to give you a chance to assess your own capacity for adaptive action, just with a brief series of questions to help you think about how much you are being affected by turbulent change and what capacity you have for responding to it. We're also going to talk about specific actions that you can take to thrive even in response to your most wicked issues. And I want to thank those of you who are online who shared your wicked issues. We'll be folding back into those as well as sharing ones of our own. Please feel free to use the chat space to talk among yourselves as we move forward. I know that in these days often we need to parallel process, multitask. And then finally we're going to talk about some resources you can use to support your continuing learning and development. I should say at this point that human systems dynamics is at the intersection of chaos and complexity and other social systems. We draw lessons out of nonlinear dynamics and chaos and complexity and use them to build both theory and practice for people who work in human systems. What we're going to do today is to share one slice of that work that we have found to be particularly useful to people as they first come into an exploration of HSD. So this should do two things. One is help you have some specific tools and methods that you can use right away. And the second is to give you a bit of a door into the work that human systems dynamics does. One of the things that we have realized over the last 2 decades is that change is changing. There was a time when we thought about change as if it were a smooth path, like throwing a ball. That in an organization, if we knew where we were and we knew where we wanted to be, we could build a path that would be smooth and predictable, that would lead us from one place to another, and that good leadership and good project planning would let us follow a very smooth path. As the world has gotten more complex, though, we found that that's often not the case, that we live in a world instead of dynamical change. Change in a dynamical system is much more like a drop of water. So over time, the drop begins to accumulate at the end of the faucet. And it accumulates and it grows and it gets bigger and it gets heavier until at some point it's heavy enough to break through its surface tension and plop. And immediately, another drop starts to form. And you can't predict how big the drop will be when it falls. You can't predict how often they'll drop. You can't predict even what's happening as that tension is growing up. So this change, you don't know the beginning. You don't know the end. You don't know what happens in between. You simply experience the change in a dynamical, discontinuous way. Now, what HSD does is to give you tools and methods and theory to think about dynamical change. I'm going to give you one quick example, and then we'll look at other ways in which they're same and different. When I first started supervising people, I brought someone into the company, my first employee, and I had a picture of, I thought, what they knew and where they were, and I knew where I wanted them to be, and I had a step-by-step plan that I thought was going to develop that employee into the employee I wanted them to be. I believed I had a plan. But day 2, I found that he had some gifts that I had no idea about, that there were ways in which he was going to be able to do work I could not even imagine. On day 4, I found that one of the capacities that I thought he had, he didn't have. On day 6, I found that he was very, very eager to make connections with people and to know them and to build good customer service. And at the same time, I found that numbers were not his strong point, and so reporting on his time card was a problem. And so I had suddenly moved from what I thought was a really smooth professional development cycle into something that was certainly dynamical. And I needed, in order to thrive, I needed to know how to see those changes and respond to the world as it was, rather than either deluding myself that it was a smooth path or blaming him because it was not a smooth path. There are many other places where we see examples of dynamical change. How dynamical is the change in your life? I'd like for you to think about these 5 questions. The first one is, how many decisions did you make yesterday? So think about your life yesterday. Did you make just a few decisions, or did you make many decisions, or someplace in between? So mentally put a little mark on this line that represents how many decisions you made yesterday. Question number 2. When was your most recent surprise? Was it a long time ago that your most recent surprise was a month ago or a year ago? Or was it just 10 minutes ago when you got a phone call or a conversation with a colleague? When was your most recent surprise? Question 3. How many sources of information inform your decisions? So when you get ready to make a decision, how many different sources of information do you call upon? Are there just a few that are critical to your decisions, or are there many? Again, mark where you lie on this continuum between few sources and many sources. How far ahead do you make rigorous plans? So if you make a plan at work, or I suppose at home as well, if you make a plan, how far ahead can you reasonably plan in any kind of reliable way? A year? Can you make a year-long plan? Or are you pretty much planning in 10-minute increments? Or someplace in between? And finally, how many people do you have in your network? Either your professional network or your personal network. How many different people are there who provide information and support to you and to whom you provide information and support? How dense is that network that supports you in your life and work? So I'd like for you to ask yourself all these questions. Mark where you are on the lists. And then we'll talk about how this shows up with regard to dynamic and dynamical. Change is changing. You tend to see dynamic, predictable, smooth, continuous change when you have few decisions to make, when you can look a long time ahead, when you have few sources of information, when it's a long time between surprises, when you can plan far out into the future, and when you have few people in your network, and you need few people in your network, that you tend then to have stable experience, dynamic, smooth change. Wherever you're standing at one moment, you can predict where you're going to be the next moment. On the other hand, if you have many, many decisions coming in, you have surprises coming at frequent pace, you have many sources of information that are critical to your decision making, you can only decide in a short period of time, make plans, short plans ahead, and you have many, many people that you're depending on and giving and getting information from, that's when you tend to experience dynamical change. So you can see from where you lie along these continua, how dynamical the change is in your life. Now, the tools that we've been taught to use historically help us with dynamic change. Many of us don't have tools for working effectively with dynamical change. And because we don't, it gives us stress, it makes us worry, it makes us at risk, ourselves and our organizations at risk. What you need are tools and abilities to work with dynamical change in order to live when you have many decisions, quick, frequent surprises, many sources of information, short planning horizon, and many people in your networks. That's what we're going to share with you. Dynamic change, the ways that you tell if you're in dynamic change, there's a very clear start and end. There's a predictable outcome. You know ahead of time what is going to turn out. There's a predictable path. So any place along the time between beginning to end, if you know where you are, you know where the next step will be. No surprises. There are a few critical factors. Like when you throw the ball, there's the speed and direction of the ball, there's the weight of the ball, and there's gravity. Maybe a little air resistance, but few factors and ones that you can name. It's close to outside influences. So when you throw that ball and expect it to go in a smooth arc, you assume that the wind isn't blowing. It's replicable. So if you start in the same place and you do the same things, you'll end up in the same place. There's clear cause and effect. So if something goes wrong in this process, you can see what it was the cause, what was the effect. You can make an improvement and do it right the next time. And finally, the change is continuous. It moves from beginning to end in a really smooth way, a kind of artistic, smooth way, as if you would throw a ball. That's dynamic change. Now, it's possible to think of some human systems work in this way. Like a project, you might think that a project has a start and an end. You can set up what the outcomes are going to be. You can know the steps you're going to take to get there. You can know what your critical success factors are. You can close your project team away from the rest of the world so they don't get distracted. If you can do one project well, you know you can do another project well. If something goes wrong, you can find a root cause, and you know any day what the next day will look like. It's possible to think of a project that way. Our experience, however, is a bit more dynamical. With dynamical change, things are always in transition. The system never goes to an absolute rest. The future is unknown, so at any point you can't predict what's going to happen. There are lots of equal paths that you can go one direction or another direction and still get to the same end point. There are lots of critical factors, more than you can imagine. The system is open to outside influence. Each incident is unique. You don't know the cause and effect. In fact, every cause is also an effect, and every effect is also a cause. And finally, the change is discontinuous, and you stand in one place. You don't know what the next step will be. In fact, it may even look like the change has stopped. but then it'll start again. So if you think about the dripping faucet, you can see how this is true. It's always in transition. You can't tell what the future is going to be. It may take a long time for the next drop to come. It may come quickly. There are lots of factors that affect when the drop will be there. The outside influence, the wind blowing, the time, the heat. Each drop is unique. The way the water comes and the way the first drop falls influences how the second might, and the change goes plop, plop, plop. You can also think about the way a project works in this way, always in transition. You don't know really what the future is. There are lots of different ways to get the same job done. There are factors, more factors than you can imagine, affect the success of the project. Outside influences are going to have an effect. Every project is unique. The causes and effects are mixed up. So, for example, something begins, a friction between people in a project, and that friction causes more friction, which causes more friction, which causes more friction. You can't ever say that that friction or personality conflict is a cause of something or an effect of something, because it's both cause and effect. And sometimes in a project it can seem like things are completely stuck, and then it bursts through. So you can see several different examples of dynamic change in our business with human systems. We've talked about the thrown ball. A journey that you've planned is a smooth, dynamic system, at least when it works well. Theories about team building, about change, about learning, about project management, all of those theoretical structures talk about a smooth path, a step-by-step path that brings you from where you are to where you want to be. Management by objective is a smooth, dynamic process. And strategic planning assumes that we've got our vision, we know our steps, we're going to go step, 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 and end up where we want to be. All of those are approaches that take a dynamic assumption to human change. On the dynamical end, though, it's more like popcorn. Sit, 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 pop. A disrupted journey is a dynamical trip. The last air flight I took, my bag didn't get there, and as I was waiting for the bag to come, recognizing this was not going to be a dynamic trip, much more a dynamical one, a fellow walked up to me and asked in broken English if I knew where his bag was. And I said, well, it's probably with mine. And so I helped him get his bag plans made, and in the course of that, he said, we were in Washington, D.C., he said, do you know a hotel where I can stay tonight that's cheap? And I said, are you on the metro? And he said, what's that? And I said, And we stood around for a little while until there was another fellow I heard talking on a phone about going to a Holiday Inn I knew close to Washington National Airport. And so I connected my Russian friend, my newfound Russian friend, with that fellow who had himself a dynamic plan for getting to a place to sleep that night. And so we took our Russian friend's dynamical trip and tried to give it a bit of dynamic path, a disrupted journey. Now, experience in all of these areas are dynamical. Even though our theories for teaming and change and learning and project management assume a smooth path, our experience in developing a team or in helping change happen or helping learning happen or our own learning or project management, our experience is a very discontinuous, unpredictable, surprising path where the surprises can be very positive or they can be very negative. But I don't know anyone who's ever built a team, managed a change process, learned something new, or managed a project that has not had some kind of surprising shift in a process. So we need to learn how to handle those in order to work well. Management by walking around is one of the tools that has been developed to help managers deal with dynamical change. So if you're around and you're watching what happens, then you're nearby when surprises happen, and you can engage with the system wisely and well. And what we call adaptive planning is a dynamical response to strategic planning. And we'll be talking a moment in the adaptive action model and a particular way to take the dynamical step. And finally, we need to talk about the skills. Because in dynamical change, this new kind of surprising change, your historical habits of practice don't work. You can no longer predict what's going to happen. You can't control it. You can't plan a long-term plan. You can't repeat what's happened in the past. You can't tolerate diversity. You can't depend on objectives, so you can't depend on the fact that you say what the end point is and be able to get there. Alignment doesn't make a lot of sense, and you cannot avoid risk. So when you're working in dynamical change, the things that are your habits of dynamic change don't work. On the other hand, you can anticipate, even though you
Hi, Glenda. If you're hearing me, we have lost you for a moment. And this is indeed dynamical change, the avalanche that's happened. So I'm hoping that we can get Glenda back up. And
do you hear me now?
We do, Glenda. Okay, great. Thanks. That was a perfect metaphor. Okay, keep going.
That was dynamical change. You see, we could adapt. We were prepared for that future because we've done webinars before. We see patterns in the past, but this one was unique. Diversity, we depend on the intention and not just the objective. That was a perfectly timed example. You can't get aligned because the difference in the system is so great, but you can get coherent so that each difference has a place in the system, and you can't avoid risk, but you can mitigate it. So those of you who have done experienced project management, not just studied it, but really managed a project, know the ways in which you spontaneously have built an ability, even though you think and talk about a project plan as if it were dynamic. You know that you're a good project manager and a successful one because you're able to anticipate what might happen. You adapt in the moment. You're prepared for various things. Asking to go back to anticipate and adapt. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Royce. So, yes, in a dynamical system where it's like a smooth path, you can predict what's going to happen. But in a dynamical system, you can't predict it. You can't know it ahead of time, but you can anticipate it. You can look at what are the possibilities and be prepared for multiple possibilities. You can't control it, but you can adapt. I once had a client who we had managed a project and done a project with Joe, and it had been the project from hell. And at the end, as we sat down to do a post-project review, I said, "Oh, Joe, I am so sorry that this project was so difficult. I really apologize." And he said, "What do you mean? It was a perfect project." He said, "You can always know that things are going to go wrong in a project. That's not the measure of its success or failure. What is a measure of success is that you were able to anticipate and adapt quickly when things got off track, and we never spent more than a day out of missing. That, he said, is major success. So that was because we anticipated and adapted to change as it was coming. Yes, Julia, the tipping point is an example of dynamical change. That this plot spot, and those of you who have read the tipping point, Gladwell's tipping point, it is the point in a dynamical system where that surprising change takes place. Though one of the important things about HSD is that we look at the tipping point as a single point, but the important things about the system are what happened leading up to that and what happens following it. In that moment, you can't either anticipate or adapt, but the place where you have power, ability to thrive with regard to the tipping point is in seeing the system as it prepares for the tip and in helping shape the system after the tip. So in a dynamical system, there's certain things that you can do. Now I want to share with you just really quickly the underlying worldview that gives us this idea about dynamical systems. We talk about a complex adaptive system which self-organizes. And a complex adaptive system is a collection of individual agents who have the freedom to act in unpredictable ways and whose actions are interconnected such that they produce system-wide patterns. Now, those agents may be individual team members. So a collection of team members who have the freedom to act in unpredictable ways, but as they act, they're interconnected so that you end up with a high-performing team. The agents may be departments working then it constrains what people are going to be willing and able to do in future. So if the next employee who joins is going to fall into that culture, and the next one, and the next one, and as people fall in, it strengthens the culture, and as this culture gets stronger, it controls how people behave. The same thing is true of thoughts. So if you think about the agents as random thoughts, when I get an aha, that aha helps me interpret the next piece of data that comes. And then the pieces of data fill in the ahas. Now, the blessing here is that the patterns emerge from the parts and the patterns sustain the parts. The curse is that the pattern emerges from the parts and the pattern constrains the parts. If the pattern is productive, then the system will become more and more productive. If the system is unproductive, dysfunctional, then it will tend to suck agents into the dysfunction. And so our job as change agents is to influence the action of the agents so that the patterns that come up tend toward health rather than tending toward dysfunction. And the way that we do that is one simple adaptive action process. And that's the tool that I want to share with you today. It's called the adaptive action model. We use it in lots of ways, and it is incredibly simple, deceptively simple. One of the reasons that we make simple tools in HSD is that we know that you have complicated problems. Complex, complicated, dynamical problems. And the last thing you need is a tool that's really complicated. What you need is something that's simple that helps you cut through the complications so that you can see an option for action. So the adaptive action model is one of the very simple and most powerful tools we have. It consists of 3 questions. Question number 1. What? So you're in a situation, you're in a dynamical situation, the tension is accumulating, you think a pattern may be coming, you ask yourself what? What's going on? What do I see? What do I know? What do others know? What did I expect? What am I observing? What? First question. Second question. So what? So what does it mean? So what does it mean to me, to others, to the past I have experienced, to the future I expect, to the outside, to the inside, to emotions, to opportunities? So what does it mean? Third question. Now what? Now what will we do? What are our options for action? Which one will we choose? What will we do? Then we do it. And then all the agents around us in this complex system shift. And then we have to ask ourselves at a different moment, different place and time, what are we noticing? So what does it mean? Now what will we do? We do it, and then there's a new what. So the cycle goes around and around and around, and it's the way that you adapt in a dynamical system. It's the way that you thrive in a dynamical system is by staying engaged with the what, so what, now what. Let's dig into each of these questions a little more specifically, but before we do that, I want to give you an example that we have experienced here together. So Denise was on the line. She had her mic. She had it turned off, but she was listening, and she saw what? We can't hear Glenda. So what does it mean? She said, is your mute on? Now what will she do? She will speak into her mic and ask me about my mute being on. I thought my what was, oh, they can't hear me. So what does it mean? I'd better turn off the thing and turn it back on, which was my now what. And then together Denise and I said, what? Can you We were transforming a state budget, transforming a federal budget, shifting, this is a county-owned plan, looking at changes in statewide health care, looking at changes in their population. A strategic plan for her didn't make much sense. What I said instead was, what's the pattern that you're seeing now? What's going on for you? So what does that mean for the future of your organization? Now, what can you do now to make a difference? What, so what, now what? Her what was, things are changing really fast. So what does it mean? We need to get a lot of information. Now, what will we do? She brainstormed a list of people in her network and in other people's networks who would know the most about what was going on, and she set up a series of interviews for her and her staff to be in touch with all those people across the network, collecting data so that when they came back to what about their options, they could say, so what does all this information mean to us? They came up with a plan, a series of scenarios, 4 different scenarios. They defined those 4 scenarios. The what was to look at the possibilities for each of those scenarios, see what that new data means in terms of the scenarios, and wait to act. They're now ready. Because they've been doing this adaptive action cycle, they are now ready to select one of those scenarios and begin implementation. But if they had last fall developed a strategic plan, they would be helpless at this moment. They would not be thriving. They would not even be surviving. But because they moved into adaptive action, they have built their capacity to live and work in their dynamical system. So let's look at each of these questions in a little more in depth. The what. The what stage is where you observe, where you collect data, you listen to people's stories. This is the place where mindfulness practice can really be helpful, because in the what stage, you need to quiet your own assumptions, you need to quiet your own panic, you need to quiet your own anxieties and your ever and always story, and be silent in your mind so that you can observe as clearly and completely as possible what's going on around you. If you don't do that, what you're likely to observe in your what is whatever you expect to see, and that may or may not match the reality as it's happening around you. You have to use multiple information sources. Again, person say about this? What would the janitor have to say? What would a mother say? What would a poet say? What would a mathematician say? What would a politician say? Ask yourself about different points of view in different fields of study, and it'll help you get a better picture about the what. And here, too, you need to listen to your intuition. Don't let it drive and dominate, because it may carry your own assumptions forward. But use all the ways of knowing that are available to you in the moment to get the information about what's going on. So all of those things will help you get a clear what in the beginning stage. What? In the so what stage, This is where you make meaning. This is the interpretation level. And so comparing and contrasting is a lovely meaning-making method. So you can compare and contrast past, present, and future, the micro, the meso, which is the medium size, and the macro. So what's the same and different about what's happening locally and in a community and globally? How are those the same and how are they different? What are the differences and similarities between local and global action, local and global messaging, local and global culture? This is where you would analyze and synthesize to use all of the logical, meaning-making tools that you've learned through practice and theory over time. You ask 5 whys. You ask what ifs. You ask how questions and when questions. You begin to brainstorm what your options for action are. You play out scenarios. You decide on scenarios. Seek multiple points of view again about what it means, what you've observed and what it means, so that you can build clear pictures. Now, I'm saying you. This means both you as an individual and y'all, as our Texas friends say. It may be that you'll be doing this so what stage with a team, with multiple people, with y'all. And so it's not just looking at the objective what that you got, but also all the multiple ways that it's being interpreted in the so what. And this is where the coherence, where the teamwork, where the shared action begin to emerge is in the so what stage, especially when you're working with multiple folks. Then now what? This is incredibly important in dynamical systems. You have to be able to take action. If you sit and watch and watch and watch, you're not going to get more information. If you take action, consider many options. Just pick one thing. Now know that you're one of those agents in that complex, adaptive, self-organizing systems. You're one of those little objects. When you act, even if you do one thing, you're going to shift how the other agents around you work because you're all interconnected, and you have the possibility for shifting the pattern, even if you do just one thing. So you should choose to do whatever is the easiest and whatever is most likely to succeed. Don't wait until you can do the big thing. Don't wait until you figure out what's the best thing. Do the easiest. Communicate about it. Let other people know what you're doing. Share the information. Set expectations for what that one thing might do. It may be a short-term outcome, but know what you might expect in the short term. Plan to test those expectations. How will you know whether that action was different? How will you ask questions when you start your next what cycle? And then determine how long it will be before you do your what again. So that when I was working with my client and her health insurance company, we decided that selecting scenarios, that interviewing experts was the right thing to do. It was easy. It was likely to give us the information we needed. We let everybody know what that was doing. Our expectations were that we would get surprised. And we would test those expectations in the what by counting the number of surprises and recognizing the number of surprises that came out of those conversations. And we decided to do that weekly, so that every week, everybody who was making the calls would come back together, share the surprises, and go out to make the calls again, so that we were doing a what, so what, now what cycle within cycles on a weekly basis, so that each time we came together, we could make sense of what the surprises were we were seeing and begin to make the next stage. What, so what, now what? Now what I'd like to do is to go back for a moment to our what, so what, now what picture. There we are. And talk about some of the sticky issues that people brought up before the session. Now one of them was about how do we use this work to help clients, especially clients when they're coming together into collaboration, stop talking and move to action. Well, the adaptive action model can help you do that because you make this process explicit. So based on whatever the observations are, whatever the interpretation is, you ask for a particular action. It can be small, it can be interim, it can be individual or collective, but every cycle gives some action, small, medium, or large, and kicks off the next cycle of what, so what, now what. I was once using this process with a lovely group that is working on Reformation in the Roman Catholic Church. And there was a nun who wasn't supposed to be at that meeting. She was sitting at the front. And when we got to this place talking about adaptive action, Sister Mary said, do you know what? Using this model, you can never get stuck because there is always something to observe. You're always making some sense out of it, and there is always something you can do. And she said, that is a really good idea. So simply using the adaptive action model helps people get moved into action. Another one of the sticky issues was, how can I talk about human systems dynamics, this complex adaptive systems work, in a way that people can use the ideas easily? Well, I'll tell you what, I've never had anybody get confused about what, so what, now what. It does mirror and resonate with lots of planning processes. So the SPDF that comes from some total quality movements, it's essentially the scientific method. It's essentially the same thing that the technology of participation does in its ORID structure. It's just that it's demonically simple. What, so what, now what? So I find it to be a very, very good way to present the ideas. I also find that these ideas are most useful when they're embedded in a real situation and a real question. Doesn't help much to talk about the theory. The theory moves people back into what they think of as dynamic space. It's much better to use these tools embedded in a particular problem, a particular challenge, a particular opportunity with a particular group in a particular place in a particular time. And that's where it's most powerful. Another one of the sticky issues was about inclusion. So how can we use HSD to help build an inclusive culture? Either inclusive that works across silos or inclusive that works across bias and cultural or racial bias. How can we use this to build an inclusive system? Well, I've recently begun to do work particularly on racial bias and inclusion and diversity questions and issues. And my recommendation is that rather than thinking institutionally only, well, you can use this at the institutional level. You can say, what in our institutional processes, procedures, structures, systemic interventions, what there tends to support division? And this can be in terms of processes or it can be in terms of choices. So what are the systemic features that are holding this division in place? So what does it mean for the ways that we solve problems, that we look at possibilities? Now, what can we do to build a bridge across that boundary? So institutionally, this can lead you into ways to identify and reform institutional racism or institutional silos. It can also work at the very individual level, that if I, as a worker on the front lines, am constantly watching for what's working and what it means to me and the organization as a whole, and what can I do to work across siloed boundaries. What do I learn from that? What do those lessons mean? How can I share those lessons? That every single person in the organization doing what, so what, now what, can begin to wear away at those institutional silos. And in terms of race inclusion or cultural inclusion, I too can say, what do I see about this individual standing in front of me? What do I notice about their gifts, about their possibilities, about their interests, about their differences, about their similarities, about their potential, about their humanity? What do I notice about this person standing in front of me? And what does it mean for my opportunities and my ways to engage with them, to talk with them, to learn from them? So what does it mean? Now, what can I do to build a bridge to that person and to build a wonderful connection with them? And how can that step inform our relationship for working and seeing together? What, so what, now what? So when you're looking at inclusion, this adaptive action process could be used to look at breaking down silos at the institutional level or breaking down silos at the individual level. It can also be used in racial and cultural inclusion to break down systemic racism, as well as to inform individual action that shifts a culture of racism and cultural bias into one that's working on differences that really make a difference and gifts that people bring. The last sticky issue was the one that Jamie brought in about having, as I understood it, having a board that was accustomed to having honorariums and being paid with honoraria to be involved, that their expectations had been set, that they would receive financial reward for doing a certain amount of work, and now the pot is empty. There's no more money to pay for those expectations, to meet those expectations, and yet there's continuing need for that board to be connected and enthusiastic about the work that goes forward. So how would we use adaptive action in that case? Oh, lost sound again? Denise, I hope we're okay. So I wish that Jamie were here, and I would ask him, okay, Jamie, where you're standing, what is it that you're really noticing now? And as you make a list of all the things that you're noticing now about members of the board and the ways that they're connected, whether they really care about the honoraria, about how much the honoraria are, about how long they've happened, what have board members said to you recently about why they do the work they do, and what are they on that list? And how can you, moving into the now what, amplify the connections that are really most valuable to them? How can you identify and reinforce the connections that are meaningful? And what response will you see to those connections? And I would propose that if you have board members for whom the honorarium is the key or most important connection, that they really should leave the board anyway, because you want board members who are connected not because of the money they get, but because of the satisfaction that they get, because of the contribution they make, because of the networks they build, because of the lessons they learn. And so in a what, so what, now what cycle of finding out what really motivates your board members and how you can reinforce those even though there isn't funding available, I believe that you'll be able not just to sustain energy and commitment over time, but to reinforce it and strengthen it, and that you may end up with a stronger, more committed board without honoraria than with. So others may have changed, added other sticky issues, but I didn't see them. So thanks so much. Thanks so much. Oh, you're welcome, Jamie. I hope that was helpful. So let's move now through the what, so what, now what, moving forward again. Here are some other resources that you can access that may help you understand human systems dynamics and ways to work that more clearly. The HSD Institute website, www.hsdinstitute.org. Plexus Institute is an institute that takes complexity and applies it directly to primarily healthcare. So if you're interested in healthcare and healthcare reform, the Plexus Institute website would be interesting. And then Cognitive Edge is the website for Dave Snowden. And he uses complexity, particularly in knowledge management. Now each of them takes a different perspective, a different path. But as we learned that in our dynamical systems, you can come to thrive through multiple paths toward the same adaptive end. The Human Systems Dynamics Institute also offers training. There's the HSD Professional Certification Training, which we'll give some more information to at the end. And 1, 2, and 3-day open classes where we invite people to come and share in various tools and methods. Many of our HSD associates have taken HSD into very concrete, specific areas. So in the fall, we're going to offer a class using HSD to respond to and work past Six Sigma and lean manufacturing. Many organizations find that that doesn't work completely and they need HSD to finish it up. And the second one is leadership, a class in dynamical leadership that we'll be doing in the fall. We also do customized workshops where we come in and use these tools with a particular intact work team to work on, solve, respond to specific dynamical changes. These are books that you may find helpful. We will share these downloads with you and see about particular books that you may find helpful. There are also books on the website. So today we have recognized turbulent change for what it is, emergent opportunity. You've assessed your own capacity for adaptive action. You've identified specific actions you can take to thrive, even in response to your most wicked issues, and we've explored resources to support your work. I'd like to remind you that we have 2 certification training programs coming up, one in London, the first 5 days in September leading into October, and the second 5 days in late October, and one in Ottawa, Ontario in November and December. The one in Ottawa will be done in collaboration with the ALIA Institute and will include mindfulness and creative process practice. I invite you either to contact Julia Herzing at info@hsdinstitute.org or to go onto our website to see a brochure. So we are coming to the end of our time here. I'll remind you that we invite you to use this webinar multiple times, to share the slides with others. There is a tremendous, tremendous demand in these very complex times for people to be able to thrive in response to dynamical change. I invite you, implore you, to take this information and share it as widely as you can, implement it in your own practice, and join us in our discussion groups through the website to talk about how you can use HSD not just to survive, but to thrive in complex times. We also invite you to join us for our next free webinar, which is on July 15th, when we'll be talking about a particular case study and how we have used these ideas at the Institute